basically, I'm a senior product manager. I do a lot of kind of contracting for startups at the moment. So I've been contracting with like some big insurtechs, renewable energy company. I've been doing that kind of work for maybe 5 or 6 years now. Before that, I worked at a company called Ernst & Young, which is a big kind of professional services firm, as like a chartered accountant, and then working in kind of banking and financial services, learning about how financial services works, and then also moving on to more innovation and the use of technology in those firms. So looking at applications of artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotics, process automation, all those kind of buzzwords that you've probably heard about.
Sure.
Then after kind of working for EY for 9 years, I basically got to the point where I realized that there was more to life than auditing and accounting, and so wanted to start my own business. So spent some time working on a few of my own projects, and so I used the kind of freelancing of product management to support my own businesses and projects. So if any of you want to kind of hear more about that, I'm happy to catch up afterwards as well. Is that kind of enough of background?
Yes. So that sounds interesting. So currently you are more of a freelancer and you are an entrepreneur as well. Okay, that sounds interesting. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions for you. Definitely. So if you can just...
Sorry, actually, before we move on from the introductions, Mike, I did look at your profiles a little bit, and something that I saw over and over is that you enjoy helping startups or helping founders build their businesses. Tell us a little more about that. How exactly do you help them, and how has that experience been?
Yeah, sure. So the thing that I kind of realized that I do naturally over like the past 3 or 4 years was whenever I have a friend or colleague or ex-colleague who's starting a business, I found myself kind of getting quite into like learning about what they were doing and trying to see if I can help in any way. And so given I've got a bit of time off now for a few months, and so I wanted to focus on seeing if I can talk to more founders about what they're doing to see if there's any kind of consistent problems between them. So the idea is, at the moment, I'm trying to reach out to as many founders as I can. So I only started doing this at the start of July, but I've spoken to about 15 different founders of like a whole range of businesses, from some guys who did a Kickstarter and an Indiegogo where they built a hardware product that made kind of $500,000, and helping them think about how they transform their product into more of like a community play rather than a hardware product, to some other guys who building like a really easy way to host a website where it doesn't involve you having to push code to GitHub or Heroku, if you ever heard of those. So at the moment, I'm kind of talking to all of these different entrepreneurs and just finding out where common problems are. And it seems to be like things that come up quite often are people have either they've just built an MVP of something and they're wondering like, okay, how do I actually get my first users? Or their problems around, I've got some users, but I don't know how to kind of grow it from there. And I think there's also quite a few questions that are coming up around like, or problems that people are having around like framing their value proposition, because a lot of people are very good at kind of explaining what their product does, but there's a distinction that happens between explaining what your product does and explaining what your user problem is and how you're helping that user. So like a lot of people focus on my product is, I don't know, a Web3 company that uses AI to do X, when actually that's not what the user cares about. The user cares about, okay, what is it that actually helps me?
Yeah.
Exactly. So you always kind of want, it's really good kind of practice just to look through like tons of people's landing pages and see like how they frame the problem, because a lot of people, it's about telling them what they're doing as opposed to say like persuading them that this is your problem, I'm recognizing this is your problem, this is how I'm solving it. So like those kind of things that you think are kind of fundamental a lot of the time, but a lot of people just get into the building something, they're excited by an idea, and they don't kind of look to validate it as much. And I think there's also some problems that I've kind of noticed with entrepreneurs who are kind of a bit scared to push their product out there a lot of the time. So I spoke to one guy who'd built something, he'd got a few paying customers, but then wanted to spend 3 months developing out this kind of whole crazy product. when actually he had paying users right then, so it was clearly solving a problem for some, and he actually could probably focus more on getting more users, because that would then be more helpful for him to develop the product rather than building in the dark for 3 months and then launching something that maybe 80% of the features aren't useful. So actually, like, just trying to push people a little bit and challenge them, and also hold them accountable to make sure that are you focusing on the most important thing? Those are things that I've kind of picked up that are interesting. So I'm hoping with those conversations to eventually get to a place where I've got a kind of few core themes that I can create some kind of product around, or just some service where I can help entrepreneurs through these first stages prior to kind of getting to a product market fit point. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely, it does. Thank you so much. Olakune, are you here with us?
Yes, I am. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so Mike, I think we can just dive into what you have for us.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I do have some slides that I very quickly put together, so they're not fancy or anything, but hopefully it does help. Let me just see how to do this. I'm using my girlfriend's laptop at the moment, so I'm not quite sure how it works. Might not. I can't share screen. Let's try this. Right, okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Cool. And if I put it like that, you can see that as well?
Yes.
Awesome. And basically, if there's any questions that you have throughout this presentation, then feel free just to kind of pepper them in. It's not kind of a super formal thing. So obviously some of you may have done your first kind of usability tests already, but if you haven't, and there's kind of a number of points that I can talk about throughout, which hopefully might add value to future ones that you do. But the idea here is how not to mess up your very first one. So I've kind of split it into things you can do before the interview or before the usability test, what you should do during the interview, and then at the end, what are things you might want to kind of follow up with afterwards. So to start off with the pre-interview bits, basically, I think the first thing you want to do is work out what you're actually trying to test. What's the objective of your usability testing or interview? Now, obviously, that can be, it's very much dependent on what stage you are at in the product lifecycle. So that could be you're just trying to do some research right at the start, and you're just trying to use some very rough wireframes. Or it could be an existing feature that's already out there, or a proposed new feature, very high fidelity version of something. So there's working out firstly what you're going to test is important. The thing that the first tip that I kind of give you is that a lot of people, when they go into these tests, they want to try and test like the whole of the product, and they go into lots of different directions. Definitely don't do that. Try and focus on one specific process. So maybe it's the sign-up process. Or maybe it's the ability to add a post to something, or focus on one specific user behavior. So it might be that you've had a look at how users are using your product already, and you've noticed that there's a way that they're doing something that isn't consistent with the way that you had intended, and you want to investigate into that a little bit more. Or it could be just one specific feature, like how to like something, or how to upload a video or something like that. So try and focus on one specific bit, because there's always a lot of kind of background and context around that process, behavior, or feature that you can kind of dig into. And what you don't want is to have a kind of really rushed session where you end up having to just go through a load of bullet points, and you're just not going to learn anything that way. So I think the first thing that I'd say is try and hone down the thing that you want to talk about to like one or maybe two processes, if they're really two or three processes, if they're really, really small processes, but try and focus it down quite a lot. There was a question about recruiting to test, and like who should you be recruiting to test. So the first kind of big no-no, don't go to friends and family, unless, and this is kind of the one exception, I guess, unless they're going to be users of your product. And even then, it's probably not a good idea. You probably want someone else to do that interview with them. And the reason that you don't want to go to them is because friends and families tend to go one of two ways. They either will go really hard on you and they kind of push you and say, oh, this doesn't make sense at all, I don't like this, or they basically just don't want to offend you. And so therefore it's important to kind of avoid friends and family. In that sense, therefore, the ideal people you want to focus on are obviously going to be users of your products. Now that might not be, it might be that you're doing this testing before you have users, so it might be kind of an MVP and you're working out who exactly you need to test with. But I think you don't kind of overthink this process and try and focus on just getting it in front of people who you think will be your customers, rather than kind of going to the ends of the earth. If you already have a product, then definitely pick from your existing user base. There's usually questions around representative sampling. Now what that means, in case you haven't come across it before, basically means if you've got a user population where, say, it's 50% male, 50% female, 30% 18 to 24, 60% 24 to 35, and what's the remainder, 10% over that. You want to try and keep it roughly in those proportions in terms of the users that you speak to. So you would, if you had 10 people, you'd want to therefore have 3 in the first age range, 6 in the second, and 1 in the third. But it's not the end of the world if it's not completely representative. You just want to try and roughly get it to reflect your user base, basically. But often what you'll probably want to do is hone in on one specific type of user when you're doing this testing, rather than trying to address everyone all at once. In terms of how many, it's often a lot fewer than you think. You probably get most of the value that you're going to get from this type of more qualitative testing through maybe like 5 to 8 people. It's enough that you start to see common patterns, but it's not too many that it becomes onerous, because as soon as you start testing with lots and lots of people, then there's kind of marginal returns, marginal benefits that you get from testing with all those people. And you're probably better off a lot of the time using more analytical or data-led approaches when you are testing kind of more people than that. The other thing to think about when you're doing your testing is that the users you test with now might not necessarily be the user types and like personas and profiles that you test with later. So for instance, if you've got a very early stage product and you're doing testing with your current users, they may have a different profile. So they may be so say you're testing an app, they could be very kind of tech first early adopters who have a much higher proficiency with the ability to use technology and their awareness of different tools out there than users that you want to actually capture later on. So it might be that you're specifically trying to catch people who are slightly less tech savvy. So always kind of be aware of the fact that the users that you're testing with now might not be the same as the ones you're testing with later on in the life cycle, and therefore you have to think about how much weight should we give to these opinions that they're giving, and how relevant are they. So every different kind of view or perspective that you get from a tester is exactly that. It's a view, it's an opinion. You decide as a designer what opinions, views and perspectives you want to kind of incorporate in, and whether it makes sense to incorporate in. It's definitely not a case where they suggest something, you go away and take that and design that into the product. It's also good to try and get recurring testers. So what I mean by that is if you test one feature with one user, rather than having to go through the whole rigmarole of explaining the product to them and explaining everything to them later down the line, then if you can get them back later, and if they have a good experience and they got value and enjoyed it, then there's a good chance that they will come back later and are happy to kind of do more testing. I think the important thing is to be respectful of people's time in this case, and that's why a kind of half-an-hour test, especially if you're just focusing on one feature, should be more than sufficient and doesn't kind of disrupt people. You don't want to be asking for like a 2-3 hour test unless there's really good incentive for them to be testing. There was a question as well about doing usability testing remotely. So pretty much the majority of my usability testing that I've done has been remote, and it's generally been quite successful. The preparation is just slightly different than if it's in person. So obviously if it's in person, there's a bit more flexibility around kind of timings. A lot of the time you probably can get a better rapport with the person, and you don't have to worry about things like silences as much. But when you're doing remote testing, it's slightly different in that, firstly, you want to make sure that the person, you probably want a good amount of time either side of the test to make sure that the person is able to use the video software that you're using, that they arrive on time, that you can set up the recording, but generally it's just the same as kind of doing a video call. There's a few other considerations, as I said, I'll talk to you later about what do you do when there's just silence and they haven't got the video on, etc. It can be a little harder to make them feel comfortable, which is what you want to do in order to get them to really talk through what they're doing. So in terms of what should you do before the test takes place, so obviously you don't just book an interview and then you go along and do it. I mean, you can, but you just won't really get the most out of the test. So what you want to do is firstly do your homework. So if it is a user that's currently using your product, then you want to see how active that user's been. Are there specific features that they've engaged with more? Have you got any recordings? So there's software like Hotjar you may have heard of, which is kind of a session recording software. So every time that the user logs in to use the product online, it tracks kind of their movements and things, and you might be able to identify behaviours that you want to investigate a little more, or you might be able to identify specific data points or features that they're using more. So you want to go into this session knowing that, okay, they've been using this product for 3 months, that their activity rate is this, that their activity has increased or decreased if you can. All these data points will help you ensure that A, that you're not kind of over-explaining anything to them if they're very familiar with the product, B, that you can focus in on and get the most out of those sessions with people, and I don't have to see. So do those things. So then the other thing that you might have been thinking about is trying to get an interview script together. So I would definitely say you should have an interview script, so you definitely want to put questions down on a page, and think about keeping them as open-ended as you can with your questioning. You don't want to lead the user in any way, but be aware that you definitely don't want to try and stick to the plan if it's kind of going off slightly. So a lot of the worst kind of interviews will be where you've started asking a question to a user, they start explaining or showing you how they would do something, and then they go off talking about like an adjacent feature slightly off the side of it, but then you bring them back onto the actual test. Well, actually that user really wants to tell you something about something that could have been very valuable, and so it sometimes really pays to go down those rabbit holes and to understand what they want to talk about. Obviously you still want to complete the test, but it's definitely worth not trying to force your agenda on them. You want to kind of let it feel a bit more natural, like a conversation. It's not a police interrogation, it's a conversation. So then you get to the actual interview or usability test itself. So I think it's important, again, bad usability tests happen when the tester just goes straight into the scenario and getting the user to their test. The important thing to get the most out of your tester is to make them feel comfortable. So make sure they're relaxed, have a bit of a chat about them, how long you've been using the product, what do you do, all these kinds of obvious introductory questions, but also make them aware that nothing that they'll be saying will be hurting your feelings, and that any of the errors or problems that they have using the product aren't their failings, it's basically your failings or the product's failings, that it doesn't kind of guide them or explain enough. So they should never feel like stupid or anxious about using something. You basically, every time you feel like that they might be kind of going down that way or thinking, sorry, this has taken so long, just make sure you reaffirm to them that it's not a problem, and it's kind of up to you as a designer to make sure it's easier for them in the future. The other thing that's important is to show that you're impartial. So basically, you don't want to, especially if it's your product, you don't want to let them know that it's your product, really. It's important not to lie to testers, but you don't want to make them think that this is your life's work, and if they tell you something that is a problem, that it's going to ruin your day. So you want to, as much as possible, try and be like an unbiased observer. So I always kind of approach it by saying, we're just doing some testing to learn a bit about how users use the product so we can make it better for them. And that helps because it kind of shows that you're trying to align incentives with them. So you're basically saying, like, you're a user of the product, I want to make the product better. And so everything that you can tell me about the product and the things that are wrong with it will help us make a better product, which means that you use it more, which is great for me, and it's easier to use for you. So trying to make sure that you're both on the same page with it will help. You also don't want to kind of reveal too much about saying, for instance, maybe you're looking at the sign-up process, and the reason you're looking at the sign-up process is that you found that, I don't know, 80% of users don't get past a certain point. Now, you don't need to kind of reveal all that to them, I mean, ever, if you don't want to, but you also don't want to reveal it to them right at the start, because, again, you want them to have this unbiased experience. So you could just say, we're looking into how users find the onboarding experience or something like that, and then you can explain at the end a little bit more. But I think it's important because a lot of testers won't have done testing before, a lot of users won't have done testing before, and so won't know really what to experience. Like, imagine you're just told to turn up to a meeting and then someone's going to watch you while you do use a product. They're probably going to have a lot of questions, so let them know that it's okay that they have a lot of questions now, and you'll kind of reveal everything at the end, and they can kind of ask all those questions. But say it's perfectly normal to feel kind of a bit uncertain or not knowing exactly what you're doing. How else can you make them relax? I find sometimes getting them to show the process or talk through the process as it is now. So maybe your product makes it easier to do some process or functionality. You probably do already know this because you've probably done some research on it before you've designed this product, but if you get them to show how they would do something before you show them maybe a new feature in your product that you're testing out, then that might make them feel a bit more comfortable because they're showing you something that they know how to do, and that also will help you to learn if there's any other requirements or features that you might not have realized were necessary in your design. In terms of how you get the most from the test, so you definitely want to get them to use the actual product. If you can in person, then that's obviously preferable, but as I say, it's really not a big deal. If you have to do it online nowadays, there's lots of kind of good screen sharing software. Ask them to record the session, because the last thing that you want is to be scribbling down notes while you're asking questions and trying to see how they use the product. So it's massively beneficial to you if you just record it and can review it again later, because you can then also pull out clips of it that you can send to product managers or to developers to show them where bugs and things might be as well. The idea of kind of what you want to be doing while they're using the product is you're obviously prompting them to try and make sure they're talking through what they're doing and why they're doing it, asking them questions about why they're doing things in certain ways potentially. But I think that one of the most interesting things is to capture what I'm calling the invisible behaviours. So if you think when someone uses an app or a website, there's probably lots of behaviours that you don't see them doing because it's not captured on a screen or it's not captured through a click. So this could be like someone using their phone and they're just kind of trying to work out where they're going to do something, or if they're holding the phone in one hand, it could be that they have to transfer it to another hand, or they have to use a second hand in order to click a certain button. Now, you won't pick that up unless you're watching them and you're seeing them use it, but it would help, for example, with design to know that, oh, actually, like half of our users can't click this button because the phone's too big and their hand is too small. So those are cases that you learn about through watching them, but they're there's no other way that you would really have picked that up unless it was kind of you testing yourself. And so it's really interesting to actually see when they pause to do things like maybe they're using your product and they're on an app, and then they realize, actually, I need to go and check something else in order to use this. Again, that's a great data point for you, because it then tells you that, okay, well, they need to break off from this experience in order to look somewhere else. Is there a way that we can help them with that other task that they're trying to do in order to keep them in this flow? So those are all kind of useful things that you want to be observing as they're using the product. So how do you actually get them to do what you want? So these are all, that was kind of the preparation in the interview. So you haven't actually asked them to do anything yet. Basically, you want to define tasks as like broad scenarios. So hopefully they'll be your actual user. Sometimes they won't be. Sometimes you do things called guerrilla testing, which might be where you just give your product to anyone, and it's more like a pure usability test of, do they know where to go? Can they click things? And that might not be representative of your audience, but it does still have value in seeing whether someone who picks up your product cold can use it. In which case you would say you are a, I don't know, high school student who has problems with depression, and therefore you've been given this app to help with that. But generally, when you're doing tests, hopefully it is with users, and you want to keep the tasks as kind of high level and scenario based as possible. So you would say, we want you to sign up for this app, rather than we want you to go into the sign up, enter a username and passwords, click next, accept the terms and conditions. You don't want to give them kind of all that detail. You want to just tell them you want to sign up, or you want them to add a post to the page, or you want them to create a transaction, or whatever it is that your product does. And then see how they interpret that, and see how they go through the product, figuring out how to do it. If you do give them these individual instructions, then you're not going to see how they actually use your product, really. So while the test is actually going on, what are the other things you should be thinking about? So I think it's important and valuable speaking about usage context. So when they're using an app or a website or any product, when are they actually using it? If you're using the app in daylight, so maybe you're using it in the brightest period of the day, well, that could influence the colors that you're using as the background or for fonts, because it's difficult to see some colors in daylight. It could be that they're using it at nighttime, and therefore maybe a higher contrast or less of a less or more of a backlit screen is necessary. Thinking about where they're using it, so it could be that they are using your products on like a construction site or something, in which case maybe they're wearing gloves, and therefore they need like really big buttons in order to press on the screen. So thinking about where they'd actually be using this product, who's going to be using it as well. So is it going to just be one person they need to one person using the product, or do they need to work with others in order to get answers to things? So maybe it's the case that they're completing a form, but actually they need to speak to a different team within the company, or they need someone to review something before they get it signed off in the app, and therefore that will tell you that, oh, actually we need to have some way to kind of connect these users so they can see that, and then just how are they actually using the product. So as I said, are there ways that they're working around using it? So are there ways that they're trying to do something that you've got one way of doing it and they find another way to do it because it's easier for them? Those are important things to consider as you're viewing the actual test. The other thing to consider is thinking about transaction versus batch behaviours. So what I mean by that is, when they do an action on the app or on the website, do they just do one at a time, do it once and then they move on and do something else, or do they have to do multiple things at once? So for instance, if they had like a payments app, it might be that you create a flow that allows them to pay an employee. Say you're paying employees, then it might be really easy to pay one employee, but actually you need to pay 30 employees at the same time. And so it might be easier to kind of add all of these payments and submit one payment, rather than having to go through a flow each time and do it time and time again. And so thinking about whether you need to add on some kind of batch or grouping functionality that allows them to work on multiple transactions at once is useful. And that's sometimes something you don't get unless you observe or ask the question, because you might just see like, oh, actually them signing up, creating this post or creating this payment is really easy, but if they have to do it 40 times in a day, then it actually takes a long time and it's not that easy or intuitive. So I think seeing whether they do have to kind of batch transactions or batch posts or batch whatever their process is important as well. And as I said, kind of asking for workarounds. So I've seen examples in products where you'll find that a user's trying to find something, and in order to try and find it, they create specific tags which you never thought that the user should be doing in order to find this transaction at a later date. So they basically key in some additional information which wasn't the use case of the thing that you've created, but it's a way that they'd figured out of allowing them to find something more easily in the future. So that's basically telling you that they find it difficult in order to find the thing that they wanted in the first place, but also showing you how they would like to do it or how they think you should do it, which again helps you massively with the design, because if that's how intuitively they try to do it, it could be a good jumping off point for you to design from that basis as well. So it's always interesting to learn how people work around certain problems, because that's often the path of least resistance in a way that you can create something that makes it easy for them in the future. So one question that you get quite a bit is, what about silence? Especially in remote testing, there can be long periods of silence where they're trying to do something and you're not talking or they're not talking. So the first thing is, you do not want to explain what they should be doing. It's really easy, especially if you've designed the product, to say, oh no, you just need to click this, but resist that urge. Let them figure it out, because it might take them a little bit longer. And in which case, you might want to ask them, what are you trying to do right now? Or you might want to encourage them to be talking through their thought process of saying, oh, well, I'm looking for this button. I thought it would be here, but I can't see it. That's really useful information, because it tells you where they expected to see something and helps you with your design in the future. It can be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, like having that silence and letting them just kind of fumble around things, especially when you think you've designed it so well and it's so intuitive. But you just kind of have to live with it and let it go on a little bit more than you probably feel comfortable with. But the encouraging them to talk aloud will help them through, and just, again, kind of reaffirm with them that what they're doing is helping you, and that it's not some, like, if you can't find it, it's kind of our problem. And then only if they really kind of give up and they can't find it at all, should you explain how they should do the test. So what do you do once the test part of the session is over? So I think it's always good to say, ask them what they preferred about each approach, and by each approach I mean, what did they prefer about the before way they did it? Now that could be before using your products entirely, or it could be the feature prior to the updated feature that you're testing out. So what things they preferred or didn't put about that versus the new approach, and what did they prefer about the new approach versus the old approach. You'll often get a lot of the time, whenever, if you're releasing a kind of new feature and the user is very familiar with an old feature, you'll probably get a lot of pushback from them saying, like, I prefer the old way of doing it. But because people just prefer not to have change generally. But I think if they do that, push them to understand what about it did you prefer before, because often you'll find that they might not have a good example, and this is a classic case of not just listening to what the user says, because if you always listen to what the user says in a design when they're saying something, then probably nothing would ever change. But it's important to understand what they do prefer about each approach, because there might be things about the old approach which did make a lot of sense or did align with how they completed the process. I always think it's a really useful one, as much for you as it is for product managers and copywriters, is to understand how they would describe the product to a friend. Often you've got some way that you would, you've thought the product is in your head, maybe you've got a killer tagline for it, but then you actually find out when they describe it to a friend, they describe it in completely different terms or more simplistic terms. But that also tells you the value to the user of that product. So then you can see, is the value that is being provided to them the value that you thought you were giving to them? Or does it need to be that you need to surface that value in different ways? So I think that's always a really interesting question to ask. And also it can be very useful kind of getting that quote to put into copy on websites and things like that. So then how do you end the session? So once they've done all the testing and you've got nothing more to add, then I think it's important to let them know about kind of any follow-up procedures. So whether you're hopefully looking for them to do another test, or it might be that you're able to provide them with feedback on what things may or may not be incorporated into the app, letting them know about any new features that are coming, but just making sure that they're aware that their efforts haven't gone to waste and that they are being kind of considered and incorporated in some way to make it feel like a valuable use of their time. Obviously thank them for their time. At the end, it's important they've given up some time, maybe for nothing. Maybe you've kind of given them a voucher or something, but maybe not. And then celebrate. At the end, you're basically done. That's your usability test done. So that is kind of how I would run a usability test, and some of the things that I've learned from running a number of them. So don't know if anyone's got any questions they want to ask, or if hopefully some of that made sense.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much, Mike. Personally, I think I have about 2 questions here, but then let's say so I'm going to go with my questions first. I'm going to ask my questions first, and anybody that has questions, you can just drop it in the chat box. I read it out, so you can unmute yourself to ask your question. So I think I'll just ask my question. So right now, everyone on this call right now, we are designers. So we do not have software developers amongst us. Okay, we have some people that do some little bit of coding, but then we are majorly designers. So the question is, should we test with designs, interactive prototypes, or we should test with actual builds?
I think interactive prototypes are good enough the majority of the time. So like there's a number of ways that I'm sure you're aware of that you can make interactive prototypes, whether that be Figma, InVision.
Yeah.
I actually do quite a number with PowerPoint. There's a surprising amount that you can do with it.
Okay.
If you're testing with things that are lower fidelity, so sometimes you might be testing with just like boxes on a page or things like that, just make clear to say to the user, because often they're always expecting it to be like a finished product or something they're testing, but just make it clear to say to them at the start, this is, don't just say it's a wireframe because they won't know what a wireframe is often. Make sure it's clear to say to them, this is a prototype of the product. We haven't added any color designs or anything like that. What we want to focus on is the functionality of when you click on something, what happens and all that kind of thing. You want and let them know what things they won't be able to do. So like you won't be able to enter this field, or nothing will happen when you do this. So I think you do that, but I think you definitely don't need like a fully functioning development product in order to do it. Like there's you can fake a lot of things through Figma and other stuff. So yeah.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I think that answers my question. So the second question is, so should we test multiple users at once, or we should separate the users? Because if you say test multiple users at once, how do we deal with conformity? When they conform, and also how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So personally, I would never test with multiple users at once, because you then introduce many forms of like bias into the testing. Especially depending on especially if you're doing with like young people. If you're testing with young people and some of them say that they don't know how to do, well, firstly they might not want to admit not knowing how to do something, or they might feel more hesitant about actually explaining how something makes them feel. And I think also you're not going to get as much information, because if someone realizes how to do something, then that then explains for the other people how to do it, and they might not have known. So I think I can't think of, unless it's inherently a group product where they need to be using it as a group, I don't think there's generally many situations I can think of where it makes more sense to test as a group.
As a group, okay, thank you. And I think I've exhausted my questions. If you have any question, please just unmute yourself or just drop it.
Okay, Mike, so I'm going to take you a little back to remote testing again.
Okay, sure.
So basically what I wanted to ask is, how do you actually see what the user is doing? Mm-hmm. Right, so obviously we're going to, not obviously, but yeah, we could be on a call like this one, say Google Meet, Zoom, or whatever, and then you're interacting with the user, with the tester, sorry. But then how do you see what they're doing on their phone? Is there a tool that you use, or how do you see what they're actually doing on the phone?
Yeah, so if you're doing it on your phone, so obviously I'm pretty sure Android has as well, but with iPhones you can get them to record screens, which helps you afterwards, but not at the time. If you're doing
Sorry to cut you short.
Yeah.
Are there other alternatives aside testing on the phone? Because it seems like there is. So do they test on their computer? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so like most products you can test like mobile versions on a computer. So I know with like Figma you can make it so you have like a mobile prototype, so it just looks like a mobile phone. Obviously that isn't as realistic, and it's like not quite as useful. It might be that you can do, I think you can do it so they can be testing the Figma prototype on their phone while you're looking at them using it on the Figma site, so you can see where they're going. And so in that case you might be able to get it so that they have their webcam on while they're using the phone and you're watching it on the desktop, for instance. You could do it that way. I think generally if you're testing the desktop app, then obviously it's quite easy. You just get them to share their screen with whatever they're doing, but obviously it's more difficult sometimes to capture those kind of invisible behaviours sometimes. So that's the kind of slight drawback of remote testing sometimes, although as long as you're getting them to kind of talk out loud through the process, and you're kind of really clued in and paying attention to where they're kind of delayed doing things, or trying to get them to share like the whole of their computer rather than just the window might help as well, because it might be that on the second screen they're googling how to do something while we're using the product, and so that could be useful for you. But yeah, there's always going to be some drawbacks to do remote testing versus doing it in person.
I thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay.
So I've got a question from Kate Chris. So have there been any instances where you required a budget to carry out any usability test of any kind in situations where your company doesn't appreciate the kind of the idea of testing the product with friends and family? Would you advise offering an incentive to users if they agree to test your product? So sometimes it can be useful if you need to get kind of a good number of people to do your testing with. I think a lot of the time though, if you've got a kind of engaged user base and they care about the product, then you usually with a kind of a little bit of persistence you can find enough people to do it, because the whole point is you're trying to make the product better for them, and trying to align those incentives is important. But that's not to say that you shouldn't use vouchers and things like that, because it often is a nice way to reward them for their time. So I think historically we've done it so you give them a kind of £20 Amazon voucher or something like that in order to do the testing. But you just want to make sure that they're not, when you're doing this, you have to be aware of the fact that there can be therefore a bias in the users that you're recruiting, because if you incentivize them with a voucher, then you get users who are incentivized by vouchers to do testing, which might not be the same users who are consistent across your product. So for instance, you might get more students who are happy to be user testers because they want their £20 Amazon voucher to buy something, whereas more higher income testers, who could be the bulk of your users, don't really care about an Amazon voucher. And so you have to, if you are using them as an incentive to get users to test, you have to kind of be aware that it might skew your the people who you're testing with a little bit. So as long as you kind of start by targeting the people with the vouchers rather than putting the voucher out and just seeing who comes back, then I think it can work. Does that answer your question, Kate? Chris?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay. So Bella's got a question. Great. So more of a request. Can I get slides? Yeah, I can share the slides. I'll share the slides with Olakunle, I think, and then you can distribute, I guess.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Definitely, I will do that.
Cool. What phase of your design process is the best time to test? So it's probably an answer that you don't want, but basically you should be testing all throughout the process. So you want to test right from the start, and test early, like super early. So as soon as you can put just some screens in front of a user, you'll learn so much more than waiting like to do it later on. But every time you kind of feel like you've got a new feature or something ready for testing, put it in front of the user. Like you cannot overemphasize the importance of putting it in front of users. You learn so much, and it means that you don't waste time later down the road. That can often mean that you're putting things in front of them that are slightly unfinished or not the most polished, and you just have to kind of get over the fact that it's not going to be the perfect thing that you put in front of them. And as long as you make that clear to them, users are generally okay with that. But yeah, you should basically test as soon as you can and as often as you can is the answer to that. Is that okay for me?
So I think it does. I think it does actually. So I have one last question. So
sure.
We've been focused on users, and because this is user testing, we've been focused on them. But then how do we actually manage stakeholders when it comes to carrying out usability tests? Because there is this kind of process or framework that most of us go through, which is the agile process. That is shipping stuff fast and all. And most times there might not be time or a lot of time to talk to users or to validate some assumptions and everything, because we just want to ship out there. We just want to be out there. So how do we manage stakeholders?
Yeah, so I think there's a balance sometimes between, you don't necessarily need to test every button that you put out. Like for instance, if it's a question of like, should I use a red button or a green button, that's probably a question that's easier answered by putting it out there and testing through data. However, if it's like a new feature or process, I think in that case it makes more sense, because basically testing is the trade-off, isn't it, between two things. Firstly, the time it takes to do the testing versus the time it takes to develop and put something in front of users, but then also the time it takes to test versus putting out something that doesn't necessarily work in the end and it turns off users. So I think if it's an area that could massively
affect the business,
massively affect the business, or it's a sizable change to the product, then I think the argument that you basically want to make is that if you don't do it, then you're going to spend a lot longer or have a much bigger impact on your users if you don't do the testing, because you're going to make mistakes and you're going to lose things. So I think as well, if you get into a good process of like finding a good batch of users that you can test with, and you get into a good process of actually booking them and having sessions with them, you can do testing with like within a week easy with like 5 people or so. And so like if you got half-hour tests or hour tests, like you'll learn so much more through just doing like a few hours of tests than you would by building something that then has to be scrapped. And actually a lot of the time, the other thing I guess in startups is that the most precious resource a lot of the time is developer time. There's often like not enough developers to do the work, and you're basically saving development work by doing this testing. So I think those are the kind of arguments that I would frame to a stakeholder.
Okay, that makes sense. I think we have 2 more questions.
Sure.
Yes.
So what is the ideal number of participants you should test your products with? Also, how do you convince your boss to let you test the products before launch? So the ideal number of participants, as I said, it's going to vary to some extent, but I think realistically with most features, if you're testing with like 5 to 8 users, you're going to get most of the benefit that you would get through testing with like 10, 20 users. Obviously, I think you should always supplement your qualitative testing, so your usability test, your interview testing, with data from actual usage later down the line, so wider scale kind of testing. But I think most of the qualitative parts and seeing how people, where they go and things, you'll get a good view from 5 to 8 people. How do you convince your boss to let you test the product before launch? Hopefully some of those points I gave to Olakunle will be kind of consistent. I think a lot of the time it can be difficult with some bosses. However, I guess the point is, if they've hired a product designer and it's part of your process, then they have to kind of put some trust in you that it is like, you know, the way that this has to be done. And I think the argument that I would usually make is again the point that development time is scarce. We want to minimize the risk of delivery failure, and if it means that we have to do like an extra few hours or a week or a couple of weeks of testing, that means that you don't have to do throwaway work. It means that you're going to deliver a better quality product and something that's more useful to people. It's often, there's probably quite a few other like case studies and things that you can find online about examples of where user testing has helped users or has helped companies like not make huge mistakes. But I think those are the kind of ways that I would frame it usually. We've got another question for the post-testing phase. What other questions can you ask the users to better understand how they see or view the product? For instance, can I ask what they dislike or would change about the product? Yeah, I think you can. I think there's always good questions about like whether they would recommend it to a friend. I think thinking about what are, yeah, you can ask what the features they like or dislike the most, but it's probably better seeing it in the actual usage rather than asking what they do and don't like, because actually some people say they don't like something but use it anyway, and so actually the best way that you're going to get any evidence for this is actually by seeing whether they do or don't use something. Like the best example I've got is actually with movies. So the top rated movies on IMDb are things like the Shawshank Redemption, the Godfather films, but the most watched films on Netflix are Adam Sandler films like Happy Gilmore or The Hustle or whatever. So actually asking people what they like and dislike, you can do it. However, be aware that there's a high degree of variance in, and there's not a lot of correlation necessarily between what they say and what they want. So you should always try and look for what they're actually doing. I think that's always more useful. Is there a certain method to evaluate usability test results? So there's not a defined method. I don't think that everyone uses across the board, and a lot of the time, because you're only using if you're using a small number of users, there's no kind of statistical basis that you can kind of use from that, because it's too small a sample size. If you're testing with like 50, 100, a few hundred people, then you can start to have more consistent statistical methods. But really the goal of usability testing is more kind of qualitative and understanding like behaviours, rather than trying to put numbers and other things to results. I think generally you want to see like treat them as binaries. So instead of saying like how well something did, just ask yourself, were they able to do that? So I think the way that I would look at it is say, this is a task that I've outlined, like whether that I wanted them to do. How many of the participants were able to do that task? And I think you could measure, so for instance, you might want to measure how quick it takes someone to sign up, or how many times they went to the wrong screen for something. Those could be useful for you, but I think realistically the most important thing is how many people were able to complete the task that you set out for them. How do you present the results you get from your usability assessment on your portfolio case study, or what part of the usability assessment should be presented on the case study? So I think similar in that you're trying to look at how many people were able to actually complete the task. I think most other things are going to be dependent on the product. I don't think there's kind of a one size fits all. Usability is literally, can the user use the product? How easy did they find it to use? You could ask questions about how easy they found it to use, but I don't think that would give you any meaningful data really, because again, everyone has a different experience of how easy something is. Like maybe a 5 out of 10 easiness for me is someone else's 10 out of 10. So I think you have to kind of consider that, and really you're just looking at were they able to do the task that was set out. And as I say, you might want to measure ease by saying like how long did it take them to do this. and you can say like we were able to, or a conversion metric that could be something. So if you're looking at like how many people were able to sign up within 3 minutes, and you can say like we went from 60% of people able to sign up within 3 minutes to 80% of people. But a lot of the time you'll have to kind of come up with your own metrics for that. What kind of issues can introduce errors into usability testing? So can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by errors, Samuel? If you're there.
Samuel, do you want to like expatiate on that, please?
Yes. Okay, I mean like issues that could make a test go wrong, maybe for you to get wrong feedbacks from users.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think the ways the usability tests go wrong are basically if you are leading the user too much. So basically you might be telling them, you're not allowing them to explore and find something out enough. So if you guide them too much and say, you tell them to click something or whatever, you can end up with really good usability results and you end up with everyone being able to do it. However, you've guided them too much and therefore it's not a realistic representation of the usability of something. There's also operational things, so if you're doing it remotely, like not having enough time to complete something, that's obviously a way that they can go wrong. Other kind of errors that you might make with usability testing could be if you trying to focus on too small or too specific a user group who isn't representative or is like, as we spoke about at the start, when you are choosing the users that you want to test with, if for instance you only pick one type of user, male under 18, then they could be very good with tech and specifically like a very specific design of something and know exactly how to use it, when actually your users could be 50-year-old women or something like that who are very different to an 18-year-old man, and therefore they use products in a completely different way. So if you set out wrong in the first place by having the wrong participants, then that can lead you to an incorrect answer. I think also being aware that actually usability tests will give you a guide, but they're never going to be foolproof. Like just because even if you get 100% of people being able to do a task that you set out for them in your testing, doesn't guarantee that everyone is going to be able to use it afterwards. And like just being aware that you're looking for kind of directional behaviours rather than like absolute, this is going to work every time. I think that's also helpful. Does that answer your question, Samuel?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you very much, Mike. I think we're not going to like accept any more questions. I don't think anyone is dropping questions anymore. We've just wrap it up. So just want to thank you again for the informative and insightful session, and we want to like thank you for accepting to talk to us. And after this session, I think I'm just going to text you later to get in touch with you about the slides and all. So thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
It was nice
to meet you all.
Yes.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone. Catch you in a bit. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Mike. Bye.
All right, guys.
It's the full house today. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you guys, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
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 Bye, people.
Bye.